Hi everyone, my name is Amitesh, and in this video we're going to talk about a common mistake in math involving the square root. And let's just dive right into what the mistake is and where it arises. Okay, so if I write down an equation like x squared is equal to 9, how would we go about solving the equation? So conceptually, we're looking at a number x which we don't know, and the square of the number is 9. So we know that there are two possible values for x. There is the square root of 9 and the negative of the square root of 9. Okay, so the square root of 9 is 3, so we know that x is equal to 3 is a solution, but we also know that minus 3 squared is equal to 9 because minus sign times minus sign is plus sign, so we get x is equal to plus or minus 3. These are the solutions to the equation. Okay, another way of writing this is x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9. Now a separate question which looks very similar to this one is if I asked you to take just the square root of 9. Okay, what would the answer to that be? So one could say that looking at that, we could write maybe square root of 9 is equal to plus or minus 3. So I'm just going to kind of erase this. So square root of 9 is equal to plus or minus 3. Is this true? And the answer is this is not true. This is false. And there is a big difference between taking the square root of 9 and solving the equation x squared equals to 9. And the difference is that when you take the square root of a number like 9, you're only going to get one value, and that is the positive value. That is the convention in math. If you put into your calculator what is the square root of 9, it's going to tell you the answer is 3. If you put into your calculator the square root of any number that is possible to take the square root of, so any number that is not negative, you'll always get an answer which is the positive value of, if you think about the equation x squared equals 9, in this case the answer you'll get will be plus 3 for the square root of 9. But when you solve the equation x squared equals 9, you're going to get two values, x is equal to plus or minus 3. So this is a main important thing to keep in mind. So whenever you have a problem when you're taking the square root, you're always looking at the positive value of the square root in some sense. So whatever you're taking the square root of, you're taking the thing that squares to be that thing, but the positive number that squares to be that thing. Because there are always going to be two numbers that square to be something that is positive. Okay? So with that said, another thing to keep in mind, and I'm just going to kind of keep this video short, but talk about one more point involving the square root and how it works with the square. Okay, so there are two things we can do. One is we can take the square root of x squared, right? And another thing we can do is we can take the square root of x squared. So these two things look very similar, and the default answer, right? I want you to think about what you think each of these things is. So this is for any x, but if you like, you can take x to be something, not just to get a feel for it. Take x to be 3, or for example, or 4, or something like that. See what you should get for both of these. Okay? I want you to pause the video, write down in the comments below, what you think it should be and why. All right, so if you pause the video, let's dive right into what these two should be. So I'm going to start off with the slightly easier one, which is the square root of x the whole squared. Okay, so what happens here is if you take the square root of x the whole squared, the answer is just going to be x, which is what you expect. The square root and the square are inverse operations in some sense. So you expect that this should be true, and the answer is that it is true because the square root of x is a number that squares to be x, right? There is also the negative of square root of x, which also squares to be x. But square root of x is the positive number that squares to be x, like we discussed there. Now this equation only makes sense if x is at least 0, so let's keep that stipulation in mind. But now, when you take the square root of x and take its square, by definition of the square root of x, the square is going to be x. So this is going to be true, assuming x is at least 0. Okay? So that's important there. Now this quantity, square root of x squared, well, it doesn't matter what x is, we always know that, I'm just going to put this in parentheses, we always know that x squared is at least 0. So you can always take the square root of x squared, whatever x is. The question is, what do you get when you do that? Now, if you answered that you get x, right? So this is a question. Do we just get x back? Do we get x back? I'm going to show you something, and I want you to think about this. So first thing I'm going to show you is the following. Let's take x to be a certain value. Okay, so always helps when you want to check an equation, get a feel for it. Let's just plug in some x's. So I'm going to show you two x's. The first x I'm going to show you is x equals 3. So what happens when x is equal to 3? Well, then for square root of x squared, we're going to get square root of x squared is equal to square root of 3 squared, which is equal to square root of 9. And remember, the square root of 9 is just plus 3. It's always the positive value. Okay, that's the convention we use for the square root. And then if we want to write down the negative value, we just take negative square root. If we're solving an equation like this, we can write down the other solution that way. But the square root of 9 is plus 3. Now I'm going to do something sneaky. I'm going to take x equals to minus 3. What happens when x is minus 3? Well, let's try out and see. So square root of x squared is equal to square root of minus 3 squared. Right? Just plug in x equals minus 3. That is equal to, what is minus 3 squared? Well, minus 3 squared is 9. Okay, minus 3 times minus 3 is 9. So this is the square root of 9, which is plus 3. Okay, that is not equal to x, right? That is not equal to negative 3, which is x. So in fact, this identity, this is false. Okay, so this is not true that the square root of x squared is equal to x. And one way of seeing this is because there are two values. So we kind of see this in this example. There are two numbers that square to give x squared. And if we're taking the square root to be the positive one always, then we're never going to, half the time we're not going to get back the number, right? Half the time we're going to get back the negative of the number. So let's make that precise. And now I'm going to ask you, what do you think the actual answer is? Like, how can we actually write the square root of x squared as a formula in terms of x? Okay, how do we do that? And my hint is, think about x is positive and think about x is negative, because the formula is going to change depending on the sign of x. All right, so if you pause the video, state your answer down in the comments below. There are always different ways of thinking about things, so I always love to hear them. And I always learn new things about how to think about basic math all the time. You always learn stuff. So let's talk about this case. So let's take the first situation. Let's take x is at least 0. Okay, we try to find out what is the square root of x squared. So if x is at least 0, then the square root of x squared is just going to be x, because the square root of x squared is the positive number that squares to be x squared, right? So what is the positive? And when I say positive, it could also be 0. Okay, so non-negative number that squares to be x squared. So we know that x is already non-negative. We know that x squared is x squared. So we know the square root of x squared, by definition of being the non-negative number that squares to be x squared, has to be x. Okay, so that's all good. The next case is what happens when x is less than 0. So if x is less than 0, then the square root of x squared, what should it be? Well, it's going to be the non-negative number that squares to be x squared, right? So we know that x squares to be x squared, but x is not non-negative, x is negative. If you think about the case of minus 3, right? Minus 3 was negative. So what we want when we get the square root of x squared is we want to choose the positive value, or that squares to be x squared. And that's going to be negative x, because negative x squared, so I'm just going to put this in a parenthesis here, and this is going to be in green. Negative x squared is equal to x squared, right? So because of that, we know that the square root of x squared is the positive value that squares to be x squared. It's going to be negative x, okay, when x is negative. So this is the formula for the square root of x squared, and you can leave it like that. But if you've seen the absolute value, then you know what this is. This is just the absolute value of x. The absolute value just takes out the number and just makes it positive by flipping the sign if necessary. So if x is already non-negative, the absolute value is just x back. If x is negative, the absolute value is going to be minus x. So for example, the absolute value of minus 3 is plus 3. The absolute value of plus 5 is just plus 5. So here, And I've done videos on the absolute value, so I encourage you to check them out. Links of all relevant videos are down in the description below. Okay, so talked about that in detail, many videos. So here we can just say that the square root of x squared is equal to the absolute value of x. So that's going to be the modification here that I'm going to write. The square root of x squared is equal to the absolute value of x. All right, so that's the formula. So I'm going to end the video with those observations. So remember, the square root of a number, if the number is non-negative, is the non-negative number that squares to be that number. And in general, the square root and the square are not inverse operations of each other, unfortunately, but a lot of the time they are. Square root of x squared is x. In that case, they are inverses. If you take the square root and then take the square, you do get back the number assuming your number was already non-negative. So it is legal to take the square root. And if your number is anything you like, the square root of the square is not necessarily the number back, but it is the absolute value of the number. So it is the number back if you started off with a positive number. And that's kind of the setting we typically work in. So that's kind of where that comes, the idea comes. But when you take x to be negative, it's not quite true that you get the number back. All right, so thank you so much for listening. This is a sort of a common mistake in math, trying to clarify video. And I hope it was helpful for you and you enjoyed it and enjoyed playing around with it, just to kind of imagine and play around and see what actually happens. Something that, seems entirely obvious. Square root of a square or square of a square root should just be the thing back, right? But not quite. So that's the point of this video. And if you loved it, it would mean a lot to me if you could leave a like and subscribe. That would help me grow my channel and achieve my goal of really disseminating math and allowing everyone in the world to have free accessible math education, which is my ultimate goal. And by liking and subscribing, you help disseminate my videos to other people. Plus it's free and takes just a second to do so. So that would mean a lot. And I also wish you all the best, wherever you are in the world. I wish you all the best. I hope that everything's going amazing for you. I hope this video was able to help support you and you enjoyed it. And leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts, comments, feedback, anything would mean a lot to me, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as possible. So thank you so much. Have a great morning, evening, or afternoon, or night, wherever you are in the world. And please take care, and I'm super excited to see you in the next video.